All right. Welcome everybody to today's event in our continuing series on modeling and theory in population biology, a hybrid thematic program organized with the Banff International Research Station. Just want to give a quick heads up that next week we'll have Marissa Baskett talking about work on conservation and restoration management and population modeling in that context, particularly in kelp forest systems. And our event today, we have Alex Diaz-Papkovich here to tell us about population genetics and Wikipedia. So Alex has recently received his PhD at McGill University working with Simone Gravel, and he's now a postdoc at Brown working with Sohini Ramachandran. And he has spent a lot of time editing on Wikipedia and thinking about Wikipedia and its role in academic and intellectual communities, and particularly how population genetics is depicted in Wikipedia and its potential ramifications for other fields to which population genetics connects. So let me turn it over to Alex. And thank you again for being with us today.
No problem. All right, so yeah, thank you everyone for joining me. As Noah said in his introduction, my name is Alex Diaz-Papkovich. I'm a postdoc with Sohini Ramachandran at Brown University at the Data Science Institute, and today I'll be talking about population genetics on Wikipedia. So a few notes on terminology before I start. Wikipedia has articles, which can be confusing because I'm also talking about publications and things like that. So when I say publication, that's going to refer to an academic publication, a news piece, an opposite editorial, things like that. And when I say article or page, that's going to refer to a Wikipedia article. So just to keep those terms straight to avoid any confusion. And for those who are not familiar with the acronyms of LLMs or AI, I'm talking about large language models, artificial intelligence, but basically chatbots that are built into a lot of search engines and search features. So getting into it, Wikipedia, the free encyclopedia, most of us, if not all of us, are familiar with it. It's been around for a while now, since January 15th, 2001. I would say that it's probably the cornerstone of the information ecosystem right now. It's often the first search engine hit for any topic that you look up, or it's just fully highlighted. There's, some box on the side of your search that says like, here's a snippet of information, comes from Wikipedia. It's used as an official source for fact checking for a lot of websites. So for example, Facebook started using it during election cycles, things like that. So it's pretty important as the source of information on the internet, or at least like one of the huge sources. It is mostly written by anonymous or pseudonymous volunteers. So people just kind of pick a nickname or they edit from their IP, and then they just start editing things that they're interested in. It also has a very, very permissive copyright. So it's more or less free to reuse in whatever way that you want, which makes it one of the largest corpora used by chatbots and AI. So a lot of these companies that are using AI to answer questions, they use Wikipedia as a source because it's just a ton of free text that doesn't come with copyright restrictions, or rather has very loose copyright restrictions. In terms of using Wikipedia for social research, so Wikipedia does reflect society. It's a product of society and its own biases. Wikipedia is known to have very skewed demographics. They tend to be very male, tend to be very American-centric. A lot of STEM-oriented people tend to be editors. But on the other hand, Wikipedia also shapes society. It's a huge, popular, and trusted source of information. And the way that research is presented influences kind of what we believe because it's the main source of information for a lot of people. So the current project that I'm looking at, it's ongoing. It's in the early stages, and the research is unpublished. But some of the basic things I'm looking at are how are publications about genetics used on Wikipedia? How is research about population genetics in particular used by the public or presented to the public? And some questions to keep in mind during this presentation, if you're a researcher, is how is our research actually being presented to the public, and what role, if any, should population geneticists, scientists, geneticists play in how Wikipedia presents things? So some motivating examples of some of the stuff that I see when I use chatbots or when I use Wikipedia. How common is the genetics section when you look up an ethnic group or a population or something like that? So let's say I'm Cuban and I want to look up the Wikipedia article on Cubans. It's really common now that you'll get this section that's just genetics or ancestry or origins or something like that. And more, I was starting to find it. So I started to think like, how often are these sections appearing? And this is a pretty typical example of a genetics section where it runs through, autosomal studies showed like these ancestry informative markers, these admixture proportions, these haplogroups, that sort of thing. Bing AI, I was curious what happens when you ask Bing AI questions about genetics. So if you ask it, what is the genetic history of Arabs, it'll give you this big paragraph explaining the genetic history, and it says, this is what Wikipedia says. So it's actually pretty honest in that it gives the sources directly like that. One of the other things I'm interested in is what about publications that are controversial? So they might not have a lot of scientific impact, but they may have a big popular impact or public impact. So there was one article that I'll get into later by Henry Harpending from 2005 about Ashkenazi Jewish intelligence. And what ended up happening is that when I asked Bing AI about this, it actually cited the Wikipedia article, which no longer exists. It was deleted in 2020. But Bing AI is actually citing a mirrored copy of it. And interestingly, when I asked ChatGPT some questions about IQ, it goes into genetic explanations as well. But interestingly, it doesn't actually, despite the answers being similar to Bing AI, it doesn't give their sources. When you ask what sources it uses, it says, as an AI language model, I can't tell you that, which I think is a little dishonest, but that's a topic for another day. So I'm interested in how do people actually cite scientific publications as well. So, if you look up the article on human genetic variation on Wikipedia, there's one sentence that has 8 citations for one statement. And the statement basically says there's more genetic variation within population groups than between them. But it's one of these questions where you think, why does this have 8 citations rather than say like 1 or 2? So those are kind of some motivating things that I think about when I I read through Wikipedia, I use search engines, and I wonder, how did we get to this point? So some of the research questions that I have, how are academic opinions and publications presented on Wikipedia, and in what context do certain publications appear? How is population genetics research understood by the public? And specifically, I'm wondering, in the context of things like ethnicity or race or nationality, how is it being presented to them? And then another question is, how has genetics added a dimension to things like personal identity or group identity? And can we trace this through Wikipedia's history? So just to give an outline of the talk, first I'll just give an introduction to the type of data that I'm using on Wikipedia. I'll give a breakdown of what a Wikipedia article actually is for the purposes of this study. And this presentation actually has 2 parts. So the first one is going to be looking at vignettes of 2 publications specifically and seeing, how were they cited in Wikipedia? Can we take a look at their impact? What are the contexts that they're used in? And then the second part is how ancestry and genetics appear on Wikipedia articles. So sort of these genetics sections that I talked about earlier. And then lastly, I'll have some takeaways, some conclusions, some questions that I still have, or take questions that other people have. So just to give an introduction to Wikipedia data, first running through the, how do Wikipedia articles get written? So there's a couple of key principles, some basic tenets of Wikipedia. The first is that it's free to use, free to edit, and free to distribute. So anyone, for the most part, can edit a Wikipedia article at any time from any location, barring a few exceptions. And once this stuff is up there, it's free to be distributed. It can be propagated, it can be copied, it can be remixed. So it's very, very open. The material that goes on Wikipedia, some of the basic policies are that it has to be considered encyclopedic, which has a whole bunch of different definitions depending on context. And it also has to be verifiable by what the community has designated reliable sources. And these sources will change by field. Articles must adhere to a neutral point of view. And importantly, article histories are all stored and retrievable. So Wikipedia also has no firm rules. It was founded in 2001. And since then, we've actually had significant evolution on the website. So there have been lots of changes in official policies, lots of changes in cultural norms, changes in terms of the standards of how articles are written, of what sources are acceptable, and also changes just in the community. Editors that have been around for 20 years are now 20 years older. We have influxes of new users, things like that. In terms of how articles are written, Most articles can be edited by any person at any time. There's a wide range of expertise among editors. You may have people who are actually formally trained with a PhD in a particular topic who write really detailed things about it. You might also just have interested amateurs that are writing about it. It's usually good faith contributions. Most people come in, they just are interested in a topic and they want to contribute. Occasionally you do get cranks and quacks who just throw in like pseudoscientific theories and things like that. But for the most part, most people are there to contribute constructively. And occasionally you get like a back and forth in contentious areas on the website. So this is pretty important, but every edit that is made on Wikipedia is stored as a unique revision with a unique ID. So this actually lets us track the edits and the lives of articles really closely. Usually the most recent revision of an article is shown. So this is the public facing Wikipedia page. So when you go to a Wikipedia page, generally the thing that you see in front of you is the most recently edited revision. So for the data sources that we can use, I'm going to be primarily working with three tools. So the first is the article text. So this is kind of what's contained within the article, you know, the stuff that you can read. It's in wiki markup form, but it's pretty straightforward to parse. The article categories, which appear at the bottom of every Wikipedia article and give a taxonomy of the different topics. And the external link search. So this is when I want to find Wikipedia articles that are using publications or websites or things like that. So the text data, it requires a lot of cleaning and parsing. You have to understand its context as well. There's also lots of idiosyncrasies to Wikipedia data because it's been around for like 25 years now. But for the most part, you can understand what's going on just by looking at the wiki markup. And I'll have an example of that soon. So I actually use the MediaWiki API. It's a very good API, very straightforward, simple to access. Virtually all of Wikipedia is accessible via the MediaWiki API. So you can get, you know, all of the revisions of an article, you can get all of the text, you can get all of the external links, you can get all of the internal links, you can see what users are contributing, you can see the logs of pages, all of this other stuff. If you are curious about it, you can go to mediawiki.org and then on there, so I have a linked example here for the API on getting revisions, but they have lots and lots of simple code that you can use, so it's very straightforward to play with. And everything that we'll look at here can be done with the API, so you don't have to go and like manually extract pages or anything like that. The API strategy that I used was pretty straightforward, but basically, you know, step one, I pick a Wikipedia page. Step two, I go into the get the history and get every single revision and all of their IDs. Step three, for every revision ID, I just extract the content, so the text. And then step four, I perform analyses on that text. So I just do this on a huge family of articles that I'm interested in, and then I study all of that collectively. Now, as for the anatomy of a Wikipedia article look like, so this is, let's say you're looking at the population genetics Wikipedia article. This is what's known as the article space or the main space. This is a default view. So at the top of the Wikipedia page, there's actually a tab there that says article or talk. So if you're interested in the talk page and you click on that, it actually brings you to discussions about the article. So for population genetics, you can see this is the talk page here. And someone came in and said, you know, I didn't like the way people were writing about mutations. I've changed it. I hope that this is okay, or if you want to contribute. So we're not going to talk about that in this presentation, but that is also something we can look at in the future. Also, you can read the article, you can edit the article to view its source code, or you can view all of the revisions. So this is on the top right of the page. So if you click those tabs, it brings you somewhere else. So if you click edit article, it actually gives you the source code. So this is what wiki markup looks like. So it's kind of like HTML, but a little bit funkier, specific to Wikipedia. But yeah, if you click edit source or view source on an article with protected data, this is basically what you see. And this is the type of data that I'm working with. And then if you want to look at the revision history, you can see that, okay, for the population genetics articles, here's the last like 10 edits or so, and you can see the most recent revision is from March 31st. The one before that is January 11th. But you can see all of the changes that are made here. So you can click each of these individual links, and then each of them will actually take you to that specific version of the article. So very rich data source to work with, lots of information. Articles also have categories. So these are, sometimes they're automatically added, but for the most part, it's users manually going through and saying like this article belongs to this category. They're pretty straightforward for the most part. You know, if it's the article about Earth, you might have the category planets and the category solar system, or category space. So they're usually pretty straightforward. They form taxonomies, so you can have subcategories. So you can have, you know, planets of the solar system, etc. And they appear at the bottom of the articles. So for the article on population genetics, you see the categories that appear are population genetics, evolutionary biology, and statistical genetics. And so they can also have subcategories in there. So if you were to click this link for population genetics and look at the category, these are all of the topics, well, most of the topics, the screenshot cuts them off, but these are the topics within the category of population genetics. So you see, from A in allele frequency all the way up to P, panmixia, protected polymorphism, things like that. So what I do is I work within a category of articles, and then I extract all of the data from the articles that are categorized there. You can also track the usage of URLs. So for example, say this article, the complete sequence of the human genome, and it has this NIH URL. You can run it through the link search function, and it'll bring up this list of every single Wikipedia article that uses this URL. So one thing to note is that this is only for active revisions for one URL. So sometimes people will use a DOI instead of a URL, or sometimes they'll use a PubMed link or an NIH link instead of the Nature link. So you would have to do this search for each of those types of URLs, but it's not too hard to do multiple searches and then just kind of collate them. So we can see, for example, if publications are being used on multiple Wikipedia articles this way. And then just a couple notes, namespaces Wikipedia has namespaces, which is a fancy way of saying like different types of pages. So one type of page is the main space, which is Wikipedia articles, and then another is the category space, which is the article taxonomy. So those are the two that I'm using. The other ones that I've mentioned, there's meta discussions, which is called the Wikipedia space. So, whether an article should be deleted, whether policies should change, things like that. And then the talk space, which is where people go back and forth and discuss articles. So that's potential stuff for the future, but I don't use them right now. So this will be sort of the first part, the vignettes that I discussed, tracking the use of publications within Wikipedia articles. So the first thing is to talk about, how does Wikipedia provide sources? So I mentioned earlier that text must be verifiable by reliable sources. The standards of reliability have changed over the years. So, in the early days of Wikipedia, anything goes. You didn't really need a source. You could literally just write text and then people would just kind of accept it. Eventually, people started arguing about like, well, is this true? Is this not true? So you started having to get sources in there. So today, sources generally require some sort of editorial oversight or expert opinion. Scientific articles in particular, they require an expert opinion or peer review article. This is especially true for medical things, for example. And certain sources have become deprecated over time, but there's no guarantee they won't still be on Wikipedia. So, some people might say like, oh, like such and such author is not reliable on this particular topic, and then they'll remove it from one article, but it may still exist on another article because people simply don't know it's being used. So I'm going to talk about two publications here. And these are publications that have generated a lot of scientific criticism and a lot of public conversation. And one question to keep in mind is, does Wikipedia reflect the scientific conversation that is going on? So this first one is an academic publication by Cochrane and Harpending from 2000. I think it's originally from 2005. It's often indexed as 2006 because I think that was the publication year. But it's a natural history of Ashkenazi intelligence, and it was basically an article positing that that Ashkenazi Jewish individuals have higher IQ than other populations because of genetics, because of natural selection, things like that. And then the second one that I'm going to talk about is an op-ed from David Reich from 2018. Called "How is Genetics Changing Our Understanding of Race?" So it was an opinion piece by a recognized expert within the field, and I was curious about how it was being used on Wikipedia. So the methodology that I use here is, so for these articles, I try to find all of the URLs that would link to them, because some of them have multiple URLs, DOIs, archive links, mirrors, things like that. And then I would try to figure out how, and I call these aliases, and I would figure out, okay, where are these aliases being used on Wikipedia pages? And then when I find those pages, I retrieve all of the revisions of the Wikipedia articles, and then I go through the history of the Wikipedia article and see where those articles where those publications come up, how they're being used, what context they're being used in. So for the Harpending article, one of the reasons to look at this too is that at the fringes of genetic research, you have a lot of people who talk about things like race and IQ, which is generally not the focus of a lot of genetic research, but it's always kind of there at the fringes. So this was a publication that Ashkenazi Jewish IQ is from selection pressure in particular, which ended up resulting in a Wikipedia article in 2005. And this article was around for 15 years. It was deleted eventually after a community discussion, I think the second community discussion about deleting it. It's still available via the Wayback Machine on archive.org, so you can go back and see the revisions there. But despite having been deleted in 2020, it's still propagated through search, through mirrors, through media, through large language models, AI chatbots, things like that. It's much less present on Wikipedia today, and part of that is because Wikipedia policy actually changed towards a lot of scientific articles over the last several years, where Wikipedia policy now treats things like racial hereditarianism as a fringe scientific view and does not give them weight within articles because they think that the prevailing scientific opinion is that it doesn't hold water scientifically. But we can still use the Wikipedia API to find traces of the usage of these articles. Or of these publications. Sorry, I'm breaking my own terminology rules here. So, if you think about the impact of this article, this is of this publication by Harpending. Here's something written in New York Magazine in 2005 about it, and the article was titled "Are Jews Smarter?" And it says about the Harpending article: the paper contained references but no footnotes. It was not written in the genteel, dispassionate voice common to scientific inquiries, but as a polemic. Its science was mainly conjecture. Most academics expected the thing to drop like a stone. But then it goes on to say, today the paper has a lively presence on the internet. Type Ashkenazi into Google, and the first hit is the Wikipedia entry where the article gets pride of place. So you see the cultural importance of a website like Wikipedia in terms of talking about scientific topics in 2005. So I found all the aliases of this Harpending publication. There's probably a few more that I don't have, but this was fine for the moment. And I found where these were being used on Wikipedia. So when I do the link search, it actually brings up a ton of hits on Wikipedia. So you don't have to look at these too closely, but for the most part, these are archives or discussions. So they're not actually live on Wikipedia. So most of these appearances are not in articles, but they're in discussions or archives. This is useful for tracing the history of citations of publications. So for example, if you look at this first hit here that says Talk, Race and Intelligence Archive 18, this publication is no longer cited in that, but it tells me, okay, it might have been cited on that particular Wikipedia article in the past. If you do a search for the modern, so within Wikipedia articles themselves, it's actually very sparsely used. And it's used in articles about Harpending, about Cochrane, and then the Journal of Biosocial Science, and then interestingly, BRCA mutation. So I'm going to come back to that. But basically, this article has been deprecated over time. So if you look at where this publication was being used on Wikipedia and how long it was actively cited, one of the articles you can look at is Race and Intelligence, where it was mentioned in 6,583 revisions of this article. And it was live from 2005 until 2014. So it was around for quite a long time. So I did spot checks on these revisions. It was most likely used as a general reference, just kind of put in as a reading list at the bottom of the article. If you look at another article for Ashkenazi Jews in particular, you see this stuck around longer. It was added in 2005, and it was live as late as 2023, where it was finally removed as a fringe view, a fringe scientific view. So people citing the policy on Wikipedia saying, this no longer reflects the scientific viewpoints correctly. We're going to take it out. And the sentence that it appeared in there was talking about Ashkenazi Jewish IQ possibly being genetic. And it says some studies have confirmed this claim. And then the Harpending study is citation number 164. And if anyone's curious about 165, I believe that's a Richard Lynn publication from the early 2000s as well. So both of those were considered deprecated and as fringe scientific viewpoints. And then when you look at BRCA mutation, this one caught me a little off guard because it's still live and it's still active as a citation. And it's just kind of mentioned offhand in there saying that it's citation 48 that, they asserted that a defect in the BRCA gene might unleash neural growth. So I don't think that's, like a good scientific source for an article on genes, but it still is live on there. But some takeaways for for this publication in particular is that some publications live on Wikipedia for a long time, and what they say gets echoed for a long time, because we saw the article got deleted in 2020. The main Wikipedia article got deleted, and most of the references have been removed from Wikipedia because it was deprecated. But still, if you ask a chatbot, the chatbot is going to reflect things that were said back then. Is it cheating if I go and delete it from Braca right now? It's not. So Wikipedia is, freely editable or whatever. I'm not going to stop you. um, uh, so, thanks for that comment. Vignette 2. So this is the David Reich op-ed. How genetics is changing our understanding of race. So this was an interesting one because it's David Reich is a recognized expert in the field of human genetics. So and this was published in the New York Times. So this sort of thing, it can carry a lot of weight in the public opinion, in the public eye. And you also can't just say like, oh, it's just some crank on a blog saying something. But what I found was that it was used on Wikipedia to argue for ideas such as the genetic basis of race, heritability of IQ, stuff that is not really explicitly said in the piece. So looking at where this publication is used, I found it appeared in the Heritability of IQ article in November 2021, and someone essentially quoted him where he said something along the line. Yeah, he said, all traits influenced by genetics are expected to differ across populations. The genetic influences on behavior and cognition will differ across populations too. And you see it's added, the main article for this topic is race and intelligence. So this publication is being used to support this viewpoint. It was some editor came in and then took it out, and then it got put back into the introduction instead with some slightly different language, and it was ultimately removed a few hours later. So within the Heritability of IQ article, I think it was there for like 3 or 4 revisions and then quickly removed. On the article on human genetic variation, it first appeared February 2nd, 2020, and the highlighted piece was added in there saying, geneticist and expert David Reich asserted while race may be a social construct, differences in genetic ancestry that happen to correlate to many constructs today are real. It was removed 1 month later, and then it reappeared in August 2022 with 7 other citations, basically saying while there are genetic differences, the majority of genetic differences in humans are within populations, not between them. And the Reich piece is citation number 5, and then 6 through 12 are a whole bunch of other citations supporting the other part of that statement. But when you see something with a chain of like 8 citations, you can almost imagine the long drawn out sigh of an editor having to put that in there and put it into proper context. And then another example here on the article on race itself, there's a section called Defining Race, and in October 2019, he is quoted again about today's racial constructs. And this quote is still live, although the context of the paragraph has changed. So you can see that now they have a response from 67 scientists saying, no, we don't agree with this. So one scientist comes out and says something, and in the public mind that has a lot of weight, and 67 scientists have to come out with an open letter, or you need like 6 other scientific publications to say, no, we disagree, this needs to be put in a different context, things like that. So some key takeaways here is that there are still people that believe in racial hereditarianism, genetic determinism, and they are active in trying to spread that belief. They use academic literature and opinion wherever they can, even if it's not explicitly stated in there. So there's a whole bunch of examples I don't have in this talk right now, but you do see people using this kind of stuff. When these kinds of views appear on Wikipedia, they do get amplified because, especially now with large language models and search engine responses, they come away quite frequently. But one other point is that I do think Wikipedia shows itself as a very, very useful tool to measure the flow of scientific and academic information to see how the public is discussing or reading our work. And then this is the second part of the talk, where it's genetics as a modern dimension of identity, but basically it's just how often does genetics come up in terms of ancestry, origins, populations, things like that. So when we talk about ancestry on Wikipedia, and I'm using ancestry in a very loose term, this is not the genetic term of ancestry, but most ethnic, racial, or national groups, they have Wikipedia articles now. And These articles often have a section that's titled something like origins, ancestry, genetics, things like that. So it's very, very common to see a genetics section in particular. So one of the questions I had, well, how often did these appear? Because it seemed like I would just look up a random group and then you'd see genetics in there, and it caught me off guard, like, oh, this is really, really common now. And then also how many genetics terms appear within these Wikipedia articles. And the other thing is like, well, when did these start appearing? Are they relatively recent? Did they appear like immediately? What context do they appear in? Uh, but some groups also have extremely detailed articles. So there's actually a whole category called genetics by ethnicity. And the font is a little bit small here, but you can see that there's a subcategory Jewish genetics, which covers things like I think Tay-Sachs and also the I guess the demographic history of Jewish groups, things like that. But you also have genetic studies on Arabs, genetic studies on Bosniaks, Bulgarians, Croats, Filipinos, Gujarati, and so some of them are considerably more detailed than I'd expected. But in terms of the methodology that I used here, basically I looked at a bunch of Wikipedia categories of ethnic groups, and then I would crawl through them. I would highlight and I would download the articles within them if it was a relevant group, and download all of the revisions of the articles within those categories. And then once I had that, I could trace the use of genetic strings, so keywords related to genetics like genetic, DNA, haplo, autosome, chromosome, things like that, mitochondria, and then see, when do people start talking about population groups in terms of their genetics. So, these are some of the examples of the strings that I look up. There's many more that I can add. But so at this point, I have about 2 million revisions of approximately 5,000 Wikipedia articles dating back to 2001. This is, and just to talk about the talk about the revisions. This is ongoing. The data collection is ongoing because the categories are not they're not fully comprehensive in terms of everything I want to capture. So for category crawling, let's say there's an example of a category called ethnic groups by location. And within the ethnic groups by location, there might be a subcategory of ethnic groups by country. And then within ethnic groups by country, there's a category called ethnic groups in Estonia. And then this is what the Wikipedia category ethnic groups in Estonia looks like. So you can see that, not all of them are relevant. You have the 2000 census, the 2011 census, but some of them are pretty much what we want, where it's, Estonians, Armenians in the Baltic states, things like that. So those articles are of interest because I want to look at their revision history and see, okay, do they talk about genetics within those articles? As for some of the limitations right now, so categories are added by users and they're not exhaustive. So there's no systematic site-wide approach, unfortunately. There's a lot of manual collection, not in terms of like individual articles, but often finding individual categories to look at. So, oh, sorry, was there, I thought I heard something.
Once I'm done cooking the beans and stuff.
Oh, sorry, I think
I'll
that's,
go over there and I can even pull it up.
I think someone's mic is just on. So yeah, there is no systematic site-wide approach. So I do have to really go in and kind of go into the guts of Wikipedia categories to figure it out. There's a lot of irrelevant articles within categories. So these are things like censuses and stuff like that, which don't generally have genetics. And some articles, they do have quite a bit of information, but it's been split off into a sub-article. So if you look up the article on Indian people, for example, there is a genetics section, which was quite large and then got split off into the article Genetics and Archaeogenetics of South Asia. So here's an example of the Wikipedia article for Cubans. So what I did was I looked up specific keywords. So like genetic, haplo, mitochondria, autosome, chromosome, genome, PCA, DNA. And you can see that this article on the x-axis, it goes back probably to about 2005, and there was no mention of genetics until close to 2011. And then the term DNA starts getting added, the term haplotype starts getting added, chromosome, things like that. So you can see that some articles, they exist for quite a while before there's any genetic data, or rather any genetic research that gets added to them. It's a bit messy to look at keyword by keyword. So instead, for this presentation, I'm just looking at the total number of genetics keywords. So in this case, you can see the Wikipedia article for Cubans by 2024 has around 30 genetics keywords being used in it by the list of keywords that I've provided. And I find that this is true more or less across the board for a lot of the population groups that I could think of. So this is what a typical genetics section kind of looks like. Nothing like, it's just pretty much a summary of genetic research that perhaps some people found. So it says, an autosomal study found this admixture proportion in Cubans. There's high variability. We do genealogical research. We have these haplogroups that are common. Sometimes you might get like blood groups, things like that. But this is a pretty typical example of what you see. But yeah, so rather than working with the keywords individually, I can also work with the total number of keywords. So for example, here's Khoisan. So the Khoisan article was created pretty early in Wikipedia's history. So I would guess like 2003 or so, or perhaps early 2004. And starting at the start of 2004, the genetics terms start coming in. And now you have quite a few mentions of genetics within the Khoisan article, so probably 80 or so. And this is what the genetics section looks like. So there's a lot of description of sort of the history of anthropological studies of Khoisan, things like that. And if you do this for Mexicans, for example, you see that the article on Mexicans existed for quite a while, and then starting around 2010, a few genetics terms get added, and then starting 2015, you see that there's a lot more detail that starts getting added to the article. So the Mexican genetics section is considerably larger than others that I've seen. It has 3 subsections, and the general tone seems to be discussing the diversity of the population, but you can see it's got 3 subsections: genetic studies, etiological studies, and phenotypical research. And I believe the Spanish language one is pretty closely mirroring this one. The page for Ashkenazi Jews, you can see that the genetics terms is actually, because the y-axis is quite large here, it goes up to 200, but pretty much from the beginning of the article, medical genetics terms started getting added in there. And I think the first appearance of genetics was a link to a medical genetics testing center or something like that. But you can see over the course of the article's history, quite a lot of genetics terms get added, and it's in substantial detail, covering a lot of topics. So you have genetic origins, different lineages, the Hazar hypothesis, other stuff about East Asian ancestry, potential medical genetics. So it's quite comprehensive, or rather not necessarily comprehensive, sorry, quite substantial, the amount of text that's presented in there. And I found when you look at Chileans, Croats, Finns, Koreans, like these groups also have tons of mentions of genetic keywords. Ukrainians, Pashtuns, Ghanaians, Colombians, like it seems like pretty much every group that I can think of off the top of my head had one. And I was curious about, so a few takeaways, but genetics is very, very common in articles on populations now. So I was curious about how many of these articles that I've scraped. So this is a very rough number because I don't know how many of these articles are relevant. Like I said, some of them might be census articles, some of them might be about individual people, but it looks like roughly 20% of the articles that I've collected have genetics keywords in them. So it's become a pretty common phenomenon. Genetics is also what I'm calling a sticky concept. Once it's in an article, it doesn't seem to get removed because people do consider it to be basically a relevant piece of research to present. And population geneticists, I think we don't disagree with that. Like we study demographic histories of populations, and the genetics is relevant to that. The trend is, I believe, definitely going towards more articles getting these sections. And with biobanks and cohorts and things like that being quite a bit more common, I wouldn't be surprised if we see it grow substantially. It does seem to be sort of this growing axis of identity as well, where people might talk about, well, what does it mean to be from population X? Now, they might not necessarily say like, oh, you have to have this admixture proportion, but they might talk about, well, historically, like this is what this population has been. And then there is, this takeaway, like how do geneticists feel about this? Because have you ever wondered how is your research being cited on particular populations? Or, are there articles that you've seen that you think do a good job, or articles that might have done a bad job? What is relevant to discuss? What is not relevant? What's the right way to talk about this? Because it's already, it's already out in the public. It's all over Wikipedia. It's being repeated everywhere. So these are things we really need to consider. So some conclusions to wrap things up. Population genetics research is used very regularly on Wikipedia, quite commonly. The public has a very great interest in genetics or ancestry, things like that. I think the rise of sequencing services like 23andMe, Ancestry DNA really speaks to this. People are curious. They want to know about their own histories. They also want to talk about their own stories. And, we're humans. Stories are very important to us. So genetics is kind of becoming another dimension to the stories that we tell. I think Wikipedia is actually a really good tool for studying the life and impact of certain publications, because sometimes we have this notion, this very hairy notion of like, oh, something was like scientifically not necessarily popular or didn't have an impact or not even scientifically valid, but in the popular perception, it actually might have had an impact. And I think this is one way we could mention something like that. Or even for a particular publication, if it's cited in 30 Wikipedia articles and it has like 6 citations on Google Scholar, maybe that would be an interesting finding as well. Publications can get propagated in ways that are not, well, I'm sure someone predicted chatbots and AI and LLMs at some point 20 years ago. But, when Wikipedia articles get created in 2005 and deleted in 2020, are we going to see chatbots repeating stuff that is not really considered scientifically valid in 2035 because it exists in some corpus of text? And also articles about populations use genetics more often over time. So I think this is one of the ramifications of population genetics research being so common now. And those that have genetic sections, they tend to get more detail, not less. So people tend to add more studies to it. So, it's our research is being used. In terms of some future work, I'm curious about who writes these articles or these sections on genetics. Is it single contributors? Is it academics who just kind of cite their own research and then leave? Is it power users who edit tons and tons of articles on populations? Networks of people, perhaps, that might just have similar shared interests? What are people writing or reading about? So, are they talking about haplogroups, PCA, admixture, demographic history, medical genetics, or any of these kind of more common or less common? Which publications are cited more often? What's the impact of something like a biobank, the 1,000 Genomes Project, other cohorts? Does the existence of a biobank influence group identity? Because this is one of those things where, people will talk about how, if you want to talk about a group, you might refer to their art, their history, or things like that. So now do we also have things like a biobank or finding populations within biobanks? Which populations are getting genetics sections, and does this reflect research? So we know in population genetics, there's been a very strong bias towards European, North American, the global North, but also basically like wealthy countries. These are the ones that generate the population genetics research. So are these getting more detail about genetics? And is it being, when articles get sections on genetics, is it being presented in sort of like a weird anthropological study, or is it talked about in a more human way, things like that? And also, is research reifying abstractions? And I don't just mean this for population labels, but other things like GWAS and polygenic scores. These are linear models that we use to explain the world around us, but they're still very coarse models. But I haven't analyzed this yet, but I do find that GWAS and polygenic scores are being mentioned pretty regularly within Wikipedia articles as well. And are we getting to the point where we are reifying this idea of like, oh yes, like these variants cause things, and like if you have these variants, this disease, we can predict it easily, that sort of stuff. So there's lots and lots of questions here. I think this is a very rich data set to work with. So that wraps up the presentation. So I want to give a big thank you to everyone for the invitation to come and speak. Also to my supervisor, Sohini Ramachandran, and to the Huerta Sanchez and Ramachandran Supergroup, who have been very supportive, to the Brown Data Science Institute for all this work, and also acknowledging the funding there from the NIH. If people have any questions, I'm happy to take them. You can email me, my email there, or you can just look me up, and yeah, I'm always happy to chat. So thank you very much.
Right, thank you so much. That was really very nice talk, and a lot to discuss. So I imagine a lot of people have some questions. So please raise your hand. I'm actually going to just first note that there's one unanswered question in the chat from Daniel Priego Espinoza. Do you think the increasing trend in the usage of genetics related terms has to do with the advent of sequencing services like 23andMe, and maybe when the time of 23andMe and those services, does it correspond to when you see the jumps?
I imagine so. That would be a really interesting thing to see when these companies started to exist and offer their services versus the rise of genetics terms. I wouldn't be surprised because I imagine many of these genetics articles, these genetics publications, the scientific ones have been around for longer, but they might have only started getting cited when, someone around Christmas gets their results and goes, oh, that's cool, and then starts reading about their own ancestry and finds something to cite. So that's my belief. I would not be surprised. And I do see that there's a technical question about the sudden short drops of keywords within the histories of the Wikipedia articles. And yeah, somebody answered there's often vandalism. So that's when people just come in and like blank an article. It's likely that. Sometimes articles do get split off or merged or things like that. Or occasionally just like it might just be something weird. So I don't think there's any meaning to them. It's probably just like a little blip.
Okay. Was there a question from Arlen Stoltzfus?
Yeah, yes, thanks. Alex, thanks. That was fascinating. I'm a longtime Wikipedia editor, so I found this really interesting. There was a point where you said Wikipedia policy now treats racial hereditarianism as a fringe view, and there's a lot to unpack there because, so far as I understand Wikipedia, it's not that there's a policy that racial hereditarianism specifically is a fringe view, but the policy is you're not supposed to give undue attention to fringe views. And if that decision was made about hereditarianism, it must have been made locally for some specific page, and then it might have been propagated to other pages. And I'm really curious about, like, is the population genetics page, is that the place where that the editors sort of came to that idea that racial hereditarianism is a fringe theory, and was that propagated to other pages?
So yeah, that's right. So just there's some technical technical differences between a Wikipedia policy, which is site-wide and like everyone has to follow this rule, versus what I was talking about. And it's not an official policy. It was part of what was called a request for comment on a particular subject. So I'm just looking it up right here. Yeah, and you can find it in Archive 103 on the talk page of Race and Intelligence. But essentially, I think they just had a big discussion about like what is and what is not. What should we give weight to within these articles? So yeah, that was a very good summary, Arlen. But basically, the Wikipedia policy on neutrality, that all articles must maintain a neutral point of view, it has sort of a subsection on giving due weight to the proper scientific opinions. So this is especially important for something like, say, global warming, where the overwhelming scientific consensus is that, it's real and it's caused by basically by people putting carbon dioxide in the air. You're still going to find the occasional scientific publication that goes against that. So I think a policy like that comes into play to say, like, stop giving way too much weight to voices that don't represent the scientific consensus. So with respect to this specifically, there was a discussion on racial hereditarianism within the Race and Intelligence article. And then there was a request for comment, which is kind of a group of editors within an article saying, hey, can we get some outside input on this discussion? And I think that what was it? The conclusion they came to here was the theory that a genetic link exists between race and intelligence is enough of a minority viewpoint in the scientific consensus that it falls under Wikipedia's definition of a fringe theory. So that it was a locally made decision, but it does make its way outside because the involved editors, who are basically the editors who are frequently in these discussions, kind of said, like, no, we can't keep giving weight to these views that are not really reflective of the scientific consensus.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah, so I saw Marcus had a question. I think the hand went up before the chat question.
Yeah, go ahead, Mark.
Is that me?
Yep.
To what extent are the citation dates in the Wikipedia documents biased against anything before 2000, for instance? Because a lot of the documents that you referred to say things that were published in the 70s. And I want to know whether they are biased against in the citations that you come across.
I do find that most citations tend to be more recent as opposed to less recent, and I think this is just part of Wikipedia being something that exists on the internet and that its users tend to be very connected, so they tend to find things that are just that have been published since the rise of the internet. So there are it really depends on the article. So I imagine that the article on like neutral theory of mutation or something like that is going to have a lot more older references, just because that was when it was developed, but also that a lot of the sort of the core classical stuff still holds. But I do think there's more of a bias towards presenting more recent citations.
Thank you.
Yeah, and then in the chat here, oh yeah, I see. That was just a link to the Race and Intelligence article by Arlen.
So let me ask you about like scientific critiques, right? Because a lot of the fringe sorts of articles do end up with, one or more critiques in the scientific literature that, in some ways, one of the purposes of those critiques is that they can help, in these scenarios when there's a Wikipedia conversation about how reputable an article is. And I'm just kind of curious what you see on, responses to fringe articles that appear as, letters to the editor or subsequent articles in other journals.
Yeah, so it's, the idea is that if you have, say, a peer-reviewed article in a flagship paper, like you have a Nature paper and it has a particular thing that it says, it's the Wikipedia policies on things like reliable sourcing and verifiability, they will reflect that. So if somebody comes in with an editorial that says something, and there's a formal response put out by, say, a bunch of scientists within the field that say like, no, this is wrong, then that formal response will probably get, equal if not more weight. So it's, it's hard to say exactly what would happen with a particular scenario, but I think there's sort of an informal hierarchy of like, if it's formal peer-reviewed science by people within the field, and it's gone through a whole bunch of editorial revisions, and even the editors themselves, like sometimes they are experts, but often they're pretty good at figuring out like what is or what is not sort of a good source on a particular topic. That can have more weight as opposed to something like an op-ed, which is understood to be an opinion, even if it is an expert opinion. It might be relevant to mention that like, oh, such and such scientists don't, they might think this particular thing, but it does not reflect what the rest of the community says. There are occasional GWASs that come out on like behaviors or things like that, which I wouldn't say are like not great. And if they don't get a response from the scientific community, from the perspective of a Wikipedia article, it's like, well, it's just going to float around in there kind of without context for a while.
Thanks. Sam Shiner.
Yeah, really interesting talk. So I'm just curious, I mean, there is a certain value to an article, for example, that is about a fringe idea and why it's a fringe idea and why it should be ignored. How does Wikipedia deal with those kinds of articles?
So they generally do exist. So you might find something like the article on like global warming denial is a very, very prominent one. Holocaust denial as well is very, very prominent. Sorry, the article is very prominent, but it does break down, and it says like, so I mean, the article often starts with something like global warming denial is the belief that global warming is not caused by humans or minimizes our impact or something like that. And then it often has a sentence or part of the first sentence that says like, it is not accepted to be scientific fact. The scientific community rejects this. Scientific consensus is against it, something like that. So usually it comes out straight up and says like, this is a belief in a particular topic that is not supported by experts in the field. And I agree, it is very valuable to have that because it's important to learn about, what is the wrong thing that's being said and why do people believe it? And it can also be very useful to give the history of a topic. So often with a lot of these With a lot of pseudoscientific movements or anti-science movements, you find that they might be funded by a few think tanks in particular, or there are a few prominent individuals who have built their entire careers around this. And, so I think Wikipedia does often a good job of presenting these things. So I know like the two that I mentioned, global warming and Holocaust denial, but there's also things like HIV/AIDS denial. So the denial that HIV causes AIDS, all of this kind of stuff. But the basic framework is like, you say this exists, but it's considered wrong by whatever scientific metrics, by historians, by whatever, and then they give as much context as possible behind it.
So do you think it would be useful for our community to potentially write an article or two on, for example, the topics you talked about today as fringe science? I mean, is this something that we should be doing as a scientific community if we're seeing fringe ideas that are getting propagated?
I think so. If we were to do anything, I think the first thing would probably be to clean up some of the articles on the actual concepts themselves that exist. So, for example, like the one on human genetic variation is just not super well written. And there's lots of articles on kind of core concepts in genetics that they just present things that are like wrong, or if they're not wrong, they're just very poorly worded. So like my PhD research was around dimensionality reduction and clustering, and I find that a lot of the discussions of clustering in human genetics are very poorly written on Wikipedia, because it might say something, you might have a publication that says something like, we identified 2 clusters that we use for our analysis, and then when it gets to Wikipedia, it gets shortened to, there are 2 subtypes of populations within this group. And then when it gets to the LLMs, and it says like there are 2 types of cubins, there's this cuban and that cuban. So I think the first step, if we were going to do anything, was probably to like look at the actual core articles that we're interested in.
Okay, thanks.
No problem.
Actually, like to put a pin in this discussion, because I think this is actually part of what first when I first heard, Alex, that you were working in this area, I kind of imagined you were doing something a little bit closer to what Sam was just asking about, thinking about population genetics and how it's represented or misrepresented, and thinking about where there's potential for, the expert community to try to step in and maybe monitor the articles, put in some priorities. And actually, we've seen in the course of this talk, you flagging one problematic item and somebody in the group going in and fixing it while we've been talking.
Yeah.
So just want to kind of mention that as something that I'm kind of hoping that with our new professional society is something we can think about as a group in the future.
Yeah, and I'm happy to talk about that more. It's science. This is a really great opportunity for science communication for all of us to get our research out there and to actually present it in a way that would be informative, educational. I see there's a question from Mallory.
Yeah, go ahead, Mallory.
Let's see if yes, cool. That's super interesting. This is kind of staying along the lines of how can we maybe impact the conversation that's happening. So I've mainly been focused on like COVID contrarianism and public health conspiracy theories. And one thing that we've seen there is that as Wikipedia sort of rejects certain theories as fringe and unsubstantiated, you then get this backlash from those communities against Wikipedia as a whole, saying that it's biased against them. And I'm wondering, I know that you've mainly been focused on the Wikipedia proper, but what the conversation around Wikipedia looks like amongst the maybe more like white supremacist communities.
So it's you definitely in the extremists and the fringe communities. So first of all, they often get blocked because they have very obvious editing patterns, and you'll one of the things you can do with an account is you can see their a summary of their edit counts based on different articles, and if you see that someone's contributions are to like race and intelligence, Joe Biden, transgenderism, or something like that, you're like, okay, well, I don't think this person's here in good faith. So a lot of the users, their editing patterns do give them away. Generally, there's not an official policy. Well, I'm actually not sure, but a lot of the long-term editors on Wikipedia, they kind of despise the white supremacists because they come in, they cause a lot of grief, basically trolling the community. So that's the one thought of the Wikipedia editor side, where they're sick of these people. In terms of what those people think of the Wikipedia project itself, they don't like that their views aren't presented. Occasionally they branch off and they form their own Wikipedia. So like off the top of my head, I can think of like 5. I'm not going to name them, but there's quite a few that go up there. And they're essentially like Wikipedia, but just ultra racist. That being said, none of those have gained any traction everywhere. So I think the strategy of like, no, like take your garbage and leave. I think that strategy kind of works. So the hardest part is sometimes you do find individuals who are contributing in good faith, and it's hard to tell, like, is this a troll or is this like someone who's just kind of confused?
Great. Thank you. So we're here at 10 o'clock. I just want to draw attention to two items in the chat. So Joe Felsenstein identifying another area where there's a kind of a challenging discrepancy between the scientific community view and kind of how the discussion looks on Wikipedia, and Joanna Maisel suggesting a very nice idea of Wikipedia editathon for us at some point. So thanks for both of those comments. And I don't know if you have any last words, Alex, but
an editathon would be pretty fun. I think that would be an interesting thing to do, and I'd also be happy to be involved in that. So Joanna, if you could shoot me an email, maybe we can talk about that.
Sounds good. So thank you everyone for coming, and we'll see you next week for Marissa Baskett talking about conservation and kelp forests.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alex.